I am in Roscoe, Illinois at one of my favorite museums ever, Historic Auto Attractions. Now that name is somewhat misleading, as this is no ordinary auto museum. Even though the exterior is unassuming, and it's seemingly in the middle of nowhere, this place is more akin to the Smithsonian because the collection here is nothing but incredible. I have returned because the museum has opened a massive expansion with new exhibits and new artifacts. It was already a big museum, but they have doubled the exhibit space with this expansion. This is a colossus of a structure now, oh my gosh. This place is so massive that it will be split into 6 separate parts. Now let's take a journey through time here at Historic Auto Attractions. The creator of this museum, Wayne Lensing, has amassed an almost inconceivable collection of historically significant cars and artifacts. Prepare to have your mind blown. That creepy Pinocchio used to be part of the exhibits. The exhibits start off with the Wild West. It's still in its original section in the original building, but it looks like the exhibit has been changed a bit and expanded upon. That green saloon dress was worn by Mary Blanchard in Destry. Behind it is Dorothy Malone's dress from Law & Order, in which she starred alongside Ronald Reagan, and there's a wax figure of Clint Eastwood. That was John Wayne's toga saddle. It was made for him in 1941. There's a wax figure of John Wayne dressed as Rooster Cogburn. This case contains John Wayne's cowboy hat and one of his cigarette cases. This was John Wayne's personal shoehorn. It is engraved with the word Duke. Here are wax figures of the Bonanza crew, Ben, Adam, and Hoss Cartwright. Here are more relics of cowboy actors and singers. That is Tom Mix's cowboy hat. He was a very popular cowboy actor in the 1930s. That was Pierce Lydon's hat. He was another famed Western actor. These boots belong to Duncan Ronaldo, who played the Cisco Kid. There's the boots and scarf of legendary World War II hero turned actor Audie Murphy. This was Gary Cooper's original grave marker. In 1961, the actor was buried in Culver City, but he was reinterred elsewhere over a decade later, so here's his gravestone. There are some more vintage artifacts in this case, and that is another piece of film history. MGM Studios used this little prop passenger train to create scenes of trains in motion. There's a Union Pacific padlock, and a Wells Fargo belt buckle. There's some police badges, and a padlock from the famed Yuma prison. There's a letter written by Wyatt Earp's wife, and original Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid wanted posters. This corner features some screen-used props from Gunsmoke, the Great Western TV series that ran from 1955 to 1975. It had a very long run. This piano was played in Gunsmoke at some point, and this chair was used by Milburn Stone in the show, where he played Doc Adams. And here's a full costume worn by James Arness as Matt Dillon in Gunsmoke. These cases contain some guns of the Old West. And there's also this Confederate saddle. There's an Arizona Ranger shotgun, and encased in that box is a Virginia and Truckee Railroad double-barreled shotgun. It would have been carried by a railroad engineer to fend off robbers trying to steal from the Comstock Silver Lode. On the bottom is John Coulter's flintlock rifle. He was part of the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery, but stayed out west to explore Yellowstone and the Tetons. And this was Little Miss Sure Shot Annie Oakley's shotgun. It was first used by her husband Frank Butler, but he reconfigured it for Annie. There's an old 12 gauge from Laramie, Wyoming, a coach gun from El Paso, and this shotgun belonged to Sheriff John Slaughter, who truly took the law into his own hands and probably killed about 20 outlaws. This is a blunderbuss used in New England during the 1700s. There's an authentic Kentucky rifle. It was favored by Daniel Boone, and below it is a shotgun used by a Tennessee night rider named Sam Applewhite, who became a drunkard and wife beater, so his 14-year-old son killed him with this shotgun. And here are some more big rifles from the 1800s, including a very long flintlock. Here's a new section with a lot of stuff that was already here, but there are noticeably a few new things, including this big chrome scrap metal cowboy. This rifle receiver is inscribed with the name Kit Carson, 1862. Carson did command a unit during the Civil War in the area where this was found in New Mexico, so this may have been part of his rifle. These are wagon wheel hubs from the wagons of the infamous Donner Party, which got stuck in the Sierra Nevada mountains during the winter, so the survivors resorted to cannibalism. That was Oklahoma lawman Bill Tillman's revolver, and this was W.C. Barney's pistol. He was a lawman in Reno, Nevada during the 1880s. This revolver was owned by Rose Dunn, also known as the Rose of Cimarron. In her younger years, she engaged in some rather illegal exploits in Oklahoma, as she was romantically involved with a member of the Dalton gang. This is pretty awesome. Jesse James's revolver. That gun probably killed several men. And at one point when James was being pursued across the Missouri River, he dropped this gun in the water. It was uncovered decades later with the bullets loaded by Jesse James still inside. And those are Jesse James's spurs. This was Frank James's revolver. He was Jesse's lesser known brother, but he was also a robber and part of the gang. He did give up on thieving at a certain point. This is a piece of wooden siding from Jesse James's last home in St. Joseph, Missouri, the one in which he was killed in 1882. And these are some original wallpaper fragments from the room in which Jesse James was killed in that house. There's also some wood from the coffee bean tree under which Jesse James was buried in Kearney, Missouri. There's an autograph of Cole Younger, who is part of Jesse James's posse, alongside an autograph of Emmett Dalton of the Dalton gang. This case features various articles related to Buffalo Bill, more formally known as Colonel William F. Cody, who was the greatest showman of the West. This is Buffalo Bill's beaded deerskin jacket. It is dated from 1894, so it would have been worn during the time of the Wild West shows. There's a trunk from a Wild West show, and some authentic programs. And this Winchester Model 1866 rifle did belong to Buffalo Bill Cody. It is inscribed with his name. There's a 32nd Infantry tunic from the Indian Wars era, alongside a wax likeness of General George Custer, and his autograph. This bank teller's cage is new to the museum, and it was at a bank in New Hope, Kentucky, a bank that was robbed by the Jesse James gang. This is really cool. This section of the exhibit contains some Native American related artifacts. There's a teepee and a taxidermy bison in this tableau, along with a Native American wax figure. He looks rather bloodied. There's some arrowheads and bison skulls. There's some Indian Wars era caps. And that is a running buffalo hide painting with a beaded rosette. This tells the story of the running buffalo. That was Chief Red Feather's custom decorated shotgun. He was involved with the Sioux wars and peace efforts. That's a Shoshone decorated shotgun. And this musket was used at the Battle of Little Bighorn. It is attributed to Chief Spotted Elk, who led the Minneconjou Sioux at that battle. That Springfield 1873 trapdoor rifle was standard issue for US troops during the Indian Wars, and below it is an 1873 rifle decorated with weavings and brass tacks. This rifle was used and left behind at the Battle of Little Bighorn, where it was picked up by the Sioux and eventually found its way to Wounded Knee, where it was again left behind in the aftermath of that horrible massacre. These relics were found at the cabin of Curly, who was General Custer's Crow Scout during the Sioux Wars and was one of the few survivors on the United States side of Little Bighorn. That's Sitting Bull's signature. This autograph card was a souvenir from Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. This was Red Tomahawk's club. He used this when he was a U.S. Indian Agency policeman. He was one of the Sioux policemen charged with arresting Sitting Bull in 1890. He may have been carrying this club during that time, and when Sitting Bull's followers attacked them, Red Tomahawk shot Sitting Bull in the head. There's some antique arrows and a Sioux scalping knife. This is the hatchet of He-Dog, a Lakota warrior who fought in many battles during the Sioux Wars. He cut 5 notches in the hatchet to commemorate those battles. There's a mid-1800s war shirt, a bow, and some tomahawks. That's a buffalo fur coat from the 19th century, when these were quite popular, but they almost caused the extinction of bison. There are various antique tools outside this little log cabin. There's a hen in there. And here's the outhouse. I noticed that Pappy is inside, but he doesn't talk. That's kind of creepy. This is a new exhibit featuring some antique horse-drawn buggies and carriages. This Conestoga wagon is really awesome. It was built and used in the late 1700s to travel from Philadelphia to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, as its cover is clearly labeled. That was a 6-day trip back then, and this wagon could do about 10 or 15 miles per day. These are some well-restored buggies. They're very beautiful. This is a Wells Fargo Overland Stage Company U.S. mail stagecoach. It was used to transport mail and other items across the western frontier, especially in areas without railroad access. This is a classic horse-drawn hearse from the late 1800s. This one was built about 1860, and it was used in Billings, Montana. We're continuing on to some 1950s icons. This is the remaining part of the former Famous Cars and Stars section. The exhibit starts out with none other than Elvis Presley, and this was the King's 1972 Lincoln Mark IV. Elvis was a car connoisseur. Cars that he at least bought can be seen at museums across the country. He did purchase this Lincoln for himself, and at one point he drove from Memphis to LA in this very car. This wall contains the authentic last will and testament of Elvis Presley. It looks like he left a lot of his stuff, including his various trophies, to the discretion of his executor. Those are some replica Elvis jumpsuits. They actually sell replicas like these at Graceland. They're pricey. This shirt was owned and used by Elvis. And Elvis wore this shirt in the 1961 film Wild in the Country. That was his 7th movie. These are some dresses of Linda Thompson, Elvis's first girlfriend after Priscilla. She wore the evening gown in the center at the Aloha from Hawaii TV special. Elvis gave her the jacket on the right, and she wore the yellow dress on Hee Haw. Here's a full case of Elvis memorabilia. That picture of Elvis performing did hang in the trophy room at Graceland until his death. These were Elvis's glasses. They do have TCB written on them, and during a performance in Reno, Nevada, Elvis smashed these glasses against the wall in a quote fit of rage. This cigar was smoked by Elvis Presley in 1977. Ginger Alden saved this one. There's an autographed Elvis Presley scarf, and a rare 1956 Elvis belt with a buckle. It kinda resembles the Graceland Gates. That was Colonel Tom Parker's string tie. Alongside his autograph, he was Elvis's effective manager, and he's being played by Tom Hanks in the new Elvis movie. These brass peacocks belong to Vernon Presley, Elvis's father who really liked peacocks. Here's a wax figure of Elvis in a replica of his '68 comeback black leather suit. And this studio mic was actually used by Elvis Presley to record some MGM movie tracks in the '60s. This back corner contains some more Elvis memorabilia, including a little lock of the King's hair. These are some receipts from Elvis's room at the New Frontier Hotel in Las Vegas in 1956. There's Priscilla Presley's autograph, and a check for the wardrobe Elvis wore for his opening night at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. And this special Elvis Las Vegas Hilton menu was autographed by the King himself in his suite. This piece of Elvis art is really cool, as it is made out of materials that were found in Colonel Tom Parker's home. Here's a collection of James Dean memorabilia. The young actor from Fairmount, Indiana only starred in 3 movies before his death at the age of 24. James Dean was killed when he crashed his Porsche in 1955, and this is the only known surviving piece of the death car. It was removed from the left front fender by a road construction worker just before the wrecked car was taken, then the car mysteriously disappeared in 1960. These are 2 wax figures of James Dean in costumes from Rebel Without a Cause and Giant. These were at the original James Dean Gallery in Gas City, Indiana. This is James Dean's life mask. Look at the shirt he's wearing in those photos. Well, this is the real shirt worn by James Dean in those photos. Here's an impressive display on Buddy Holly, one of the great early rock and roll pioneers who died in a plane crash at the age of 22. This jacket was worn by Buddy Holly on stage. It's alongside his motorcycle license. The great Buddy Holly also wore this patterned shirt. And here's another one of his stage-worn shirts. These were Buddy Holly's sunglasses. Not his classic regular glasses, but that's still pretty cool. And these are handwritten, unpublished lyrics for a song called Painted Lady, written by the Big Bopper. This was found at the crash site where the music died. And here's an exhibit on Marilyn Monroe, featuring some really neat artifacts. This dress was made for Marilyn in the production of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, though this one was not screen used. Those were Marilyn's pearl-colored sunglasses. And there's her faux diamond cigarette case and lighter. A little snippet of Marilyn Monroe's hair is encased in there. This single seat was at Marilyn's last home in LA. This was one of Marilyn Monroe's nightgowns. This is a letter that was sent to Marilyn Monroe by 20th Century Fox, informing her that she was terminated from the film Something's Gotta Give because she kept skipping filming sessions. She was dead 8 weeks later. That is Marilyn's love seat. It was used in her Los Angeles home. This is the turquoise bustier that was worn by Jane Russell alongside Marilyn Monroe in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. This 1925 Model T Roadster pickup was used by Laurel and Hardy in their film Big Business. That's a model ship. And now moving on to the World Leaders exhibit, which shows off an impressive collection of cars used by 20th century global leaders. The presidential vehicles used to be part of this, but they've been moved into the expansion. There's also some new world leader cars as well. This is really fascinating. A 1928 Delage limousine custom built for the King of Siam. There's also some interesting wax figures. This is the presidential limousine of Juan and Evita Perón, used in Argentina. Eva Perón was wildly popular and powerful. She was essentially the spiritual leader of Argentina, but she died young in 1952. The Peronist government was overthrown in 1955, and most objects related to them were destroyed. So the car and these items are very rare. There's a signed picture of Eva Perón. This is a 1948 Daimler limousine that was used by the royal family of Great Britain. This limo was used during visits to South Africa. And here's a wax figure of Princess Diana. And this is a 1946 Daimler limousine that was used by King George VI, the father of Queen Elizabeth II. This one was largely kept in Scotland. This is the inside of the car where King George and other royals once sat. This is Mikhail Gorbachev's 1991 Mercedes SEL 540 armored limousine. The last leader of the Soviet Union used this car during the 1990s. It does have 2-inch thick bulletproof windows. This 1946 Packard Super Clipper limo was used by Colombian President Mariano Ospina Perez. He was in office between 1946 and 1950. This is Joseph Stalin's 1937 Packard limousine, which is clearly modified and heavily armored. There's a photograph of Stalin emerging from this limo in 1946. Notice that it has 3-inch thick bulletproof glass. Well, one of the worst people ever sat right there. This 1935 Packard limousine was used to transport Emperor Hirohito of Japan. He was the longest serving monarch in Japanese history, and was the leader during the militaristic period and World War II. This 1950 Soviet-made Zim Pullman limousine was used by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. He did give this car away to the Prime Minister of Norway. Behind Khrushchev's limo is a limo that was used by President John F. Kennedy. Thankfully, these two men were generally level-headed. This alcove contains some vehicles and artifacts of some horrible Nazi and fascist leaders. Historic Auto Attractions does have signage that states that these artifacts are here for historical purposes only. There's a wood-carved eagle from a Nazi administration building. And there's a wax figure of Adolf Hitler. This is a 1939 Mercedes G4. A custom-made 6-wheeled staff car. These massive vehicles were produced for parades of Nazi leaders, and this one was used by Adolf Hitler. That chair is from Adolf Hitler's yachts. That is a 1941 Fiat 1500 command car. These were used by the Italian army during World War II. This was SS Chief Heinrich Himmler's 1939 Horsch 930 V Cabriolet staff car. That's a 1942 BMW combat motorcycle with a sidecar. And this 1939 Lancia Stura parade car was used by the fascist dictator of Italy, Benito Mussolini, during his reign. Right by this wax figure of Mussolini is the last flag that was recovered from Mussolini's headquarters in Rome in 1944. This is a Hungarian Aerocross Death Squad Major's uniform. The Aerocross party members in Hungary were National Socialists who would go around murdering civilians, especially Jews. This was Eva Braun's blue gown, alongside a set of her pink lingerie. Eva Braun was Adolf Hitler's longtime mistress, and they married hours before they committed suicide. There's Eva Braun's monogram parasol, and some of her linen napkins. That was Eva Braun's pistol. The initials EB are engraved on the left side of this pistol. Here are various pieces of Hitler and Braun's silver and tableware, including a silver-plated creamer and a tablecloth labeled AH. This armband was personally owned and worn by Adolf Hitler. It was found in his Munich headquarters. These books on the philosophy of the SS were written by Heinrich Himmler, and these in particular were presented by Himmler to Hitler on his 50th birthday. There's a key to Hitler's office at the Eagle's Nest, next to some Hitler badges. That's an authentic document with the closing arguments for a military tribunal against Hitler's physician during the Nuremberg trials, alongside more of Hitler's cutlery. Here is yet another case full of extremely rare Nazi memorabilia. Much of this belonged to some higher-ups in the Nazi party. That was Major General Fritz Sackel's pistol. There's Rudolf Hess's cap, ring, and a cigar case that was gifted to the Nazi leader from the city of Salzburg after it was annexed. That was Hermann Göring's golden pistol. This is actually the cyanide capsule container that Göring carried around and used to commit suicide in 1945. This table carving set and dish also belonged to the chief of the Luftwaffe. This is a photograph of Göring's Bavarian hunting lodge that was owned by him. There's a stein that once belonged to Göring, and even more Nazi silverware. There's still more Nazi relics. These are interesting but very dastardly. This was Heinrich Himmler's pistol. Himmler was the leader of the Gestapo and a key architect of the Holocaust. And these are the remains of Himmler's eyeglasses. He was wearing these glasses when he committed suicide by cyanide. There's a jewelry chest that was found at Heinrich Himmler's house, and a document signed by him. There's his pocket watch, and some swastika car grills. This is a real concentration camp hat. These were often worn by prisoners during the Holocaust. That is a rare Nazi Allgemeine general's white top visor and an armband. And there are plenty more hats, daggers, and flags of the SS. This exhibit is really dark. Now we are going to enter the brand new expansion of the museum. It's called the East Wing. The old building and the new building are connected through here. This new structure adds an additional 50,000 feet of exhibit space and some bathrooms, which is nice. Again, it just opened, so this is a big deal. I'm really excited to see this. The first thing to see is General and President Ulysses S. Grant's carriage. He had quite a few carriages. I believe I've seen 4 of them, but he bought this one in the summer of 1865, just after the end of the war, while staying in DC, and he used it there until after his presidential terms ended. Grant liked to go fast, and actually got a speeding ticket, and then got arrested while president for speeding. That was the sash of Lieutenant Orlando Ross of Illinois. He served on the staff of General Grant during the Civil War. Here are some more artifacts of his, including the gloves he wore at General Grant's funeral, and the saddlecloth he used for the inaugural parade of President Benjamin Harrison. There's some presidential memorabilia lining the opposite wall. There's a tiny lock of George Washington's hair in there, and here's a snippet of Andrew Jackson's hair. That pen was used by President Eisenhower and a Polish defector to sign his citizenship papers. That envelope was signed by all the pallbearers from Eisenhower's funeral. Here are various invitations to presidential functions over the years. And these are a bunch of First Lady autographs. The first presidential exhibit features lots of cars and some wax figures. This is the Hall of Presidents, a lineup of wax depictions of the commanders-in-chief. Unfortunately, not all of them, mainly the more recent ones. There are wax figures of George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and Ulysses S. Grant. Jackson and Grant both look very haggard. There's Herbert Hoover, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Harry S. Truman, and Dwight D. Eisenhower. Continuing on to John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Richard Nixon. Johnson is ominously staring at Nixon from the back. Here's Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. Then there's Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and there are figures of the two most recent presidents, including Donald Trump. That's a pretty good wax figure. And next to him is the current president, Joe Biden. This is the first wax figure I've seen of him, and this one is actually very realistic. This flag flew over the United States Capitol on January 20th, 2021, during President Biden's inauguration. This is, to my knowledge, the largest presidential vehicle collection ever assembled. They have more here than the Henry Ford Museum. This 1938 Cadillac was a Secret Service car used during the Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower administrations. This display case features some FDR memorabilia. There's a monogrammed tablecloth of the Roosevelts, and some other relics from the era. That was Franklin Roosevelt's Panama hat. He wore it at the 1943 Tehran Conference. There's a matchbook from his Oval Office desk, and a piece of wood from his funeral caisson. Here are some more pieces from the times of the four-term president, including the pen he used to sign the Homeowners Loan Act of 1933. And this was FDR's cane. It was made from the horns of 20 head of Guernsey cattle. There's an interesting picture next to it. Apparently FDR's second inaugural stand was a replica of the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's home in Tennessee. It was placed in front of the White House. I had never heard of that. This presidential limousine was used by Dwight D. Eisenhower. It's a 1955 Cadillac 75. Here's a case with some Eisenhower and Truman artifacts. That flag was on the fender of an Eisenhower motorcade car. These gloves were placed on General Eisenhower's casket by his wife Mamie during the funeral. There's the general's hat, shoes, and apparently his favorite hat that he used while president. There isn't too much Truman stuff, but there's a 1949 Truman inauguration book. That's a painting of the USS Williamsburg, the presidential yacht while Truman was president, and it was on board the Williamsburg. This was one of President Harry S. Truman's presidential limousines, a 1950 Lincoln. That's really awesome. Here's another wax figure of FDR. He's in a wheelchair looking very frail, alongside wax Eleanor Roosevelt. This 1939 Ford Deluxe convertible was a Secret Service car that would have followed in Roosevelt's motorcade. This 1965 Cadillac Fleetwood limousine was used by President Lyndon B. Johnson while he was in office. That was one of LBJ's favorite cowboy hats. And those were his glasses. Here's an unopened Air Force One cigarette pack and a vice president table napkin from the Johnson era. President Lyndon Johnson used this pen to sign the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. It was part of his war on poverty. Here is one of First Lady Rosalind Carter's dresses and an eagle made out of peanuts. This presidential limousine was used by Jimmy Carter during the presidency. It's a 1976 Cadillac 60 Special Brougham sedan. They used to also have a Reagan-era car, but it's not on display. That's not all, as there is a second row full of more presidential cars. This place is beyond amazing. This is Donald Trump's Lincoln limousine. He owned and used this one just before the presidency. It was used on the campaign trail in 2016. Official presidential vehicles are now destroyed, so it's really neat to see the car of a more recent president. This 1923 Lincoln belonged to Calvin Coolidge, and was used while he was president. That's very cool. I believe this is new. Herbert Hoover's 1932 Cadillac V16 Imperial Limousine. He may have used this during his last year as president, or more likely in his long post-presidency career. This 1969 Lincoln Lehman Peterson limousine was used during the Nixon administration, primarily to transport visiting dignitaries and congressmen, but Tricky Dick was probably in this car at some point. It was also used in filming the 1999 Nixon movie. There is a wax figure of Richard Nixon in the back seat. This 1986 Chrysler Executive Limousine was owned and driven by Richard Nixon. It used to be on display at the Nixon Presidential Library, but now it's here. Richard Nixon would sit right there. This gorgeous 1962 Cadillac Fleetwood limousine was purchased by a Mexican senator who is very close with Mexican President Miguel Alemán, and this limo was used to transport former President Dwight Eisenhower when he visited Mexico. This one is incredible. President Lyndon B. Johnson's personal presidential limousine. It's a 1965 Lehman Peterson Lincoln Continental. The interior was heavily personalized by Lyndon Johnson himself. He wanted it covered with blue plaid fabric, which is very unique. It also had a TV, 2 bars, 2 stereos, a writing console, and 2 air conditioners. This 1941 Packard Rolston isn't per se a presidential vehicle, but it was owned by John Vernew Bouvier III, the father of Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. So a young Jackie probably rode in this fancy car. This was First Lady Ida McKinley's personal sleigh from the late 1800s. This hearse transported the body of the assassinated President William McKinley during his funeral ceremonies and initial interment in Canton, Ohio, back in 1901. This is fascinating. I saw these McKinley pieces many years ago at the Cruise Automotive Museum in Auburn, Indiana, which sadly closed a few years ago. I wondered what happened to these, so I'm glad they found the perfect home. This is First Lady Lucretia Garfield's mourning dress. She wore this during the funeral of her assassinated husband, President James A. Garfield. This is a piece of rope used to hang Charles Guiteau, who fatally shot President Garfield, though his doctors probably did him in. Here is a grouping of world leader wax figures, including Mikhail Gorbachev, Chairman Mao, Fidel Castro, Emperor Hirohito, Indira Gandhi, Ayatollah Khomeini, Sir Winston Churchill, Anwar Sadat, Yasser Arafat, and King Hussein of Jordan. Now entering Gangster Land. Featuring some really phenomenal artifacts of Prohibition-era criminals, this exhibit is larger than it used to be and also has some true crime stuff now. This is John Dillinger's getaway car. He stole this 1932 Studebaker Commander that belonged to the sheriff to escape the police after he robbed more than $75,000 from a Greencastle, Indiana bank. That was the biggest bank robbery in history at that time. Here's a case full of really impressive Dillinger artifacts. John Dillinger was killed outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago after seeing the movie Manhattan Melodrama, and this suit was worn by Clark Gable in that film, the last one Dillinger saw. These guns belong to the Dillinger family. The rifle second from the top is believed to have been the first gun that Lil John Dillinger ever fired. This is a piece of tin ceiling tile from the American Trades Bank in Racine, Wisconsin, which Dillinger robbed in 1933. The ceiling was damaged by a shootout, but Dillinger escaped with 3 hostages in tow. That suitcase was used by Dillinger's gang, and there's the badge worn by the constable during the Little Bohemia raid. This is a piece of the pants that John Dillinger was wearing when he was killed. It was taken from his body that night as a souvenir, and that is the gun that killed John Dillinger. East Chicago police officer Martin Zarkovich fired the fatal shot from this gun in the ambush on Dillinger at the Biograph Theater on July 22, 1934. There's the officer's badge and award. Here are some more Dillinger relics, including a Colt and silencer that was used by his gang. This was one of John Dillinger's pistols. He left it behind during the escape from the Little Bohemia Lodge. And this is Dillinger's death mask. There are a lot of Dillinger death masks at various museums, but they claim that this is the real one taken off of his cold dead face. This is a Bonnie and Clyde death car, a replica of the one that the infamous couple was gunned down in. The real one is at a casino in Primm, Nevada, but this one was used for the 1967 Bonnie and Clyde film starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway. This car was shot up with a Thompson submachine gun. These are the real hats that were worn by Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker on the day they were killed. They were both shot about 50 times. There are bullet holes and blood stains in these hats. This revolver was in the death car when they were ambushed on May 23, 1934. This .22 Colt rifle barrel was used by Raymond Harris, a member of the Bonnie and Clyde gang. Bonnie tried to burn this rifle when they were caught robbing a bank. It's definitely damaged and the rest of the gun is gone. This flashlight was used by the Barrow gang. It was left behind after a shootout in Dexter, Iowa. These bullets were recovered from the Bonnie and Clyde death car. This revolver was once carried by mob boss and Las Vegas gambling icon Benny Binion. Here's a photo of Lizzie Borden's jury, and a piece of chimney brick from the Lizzie Borden house. Lizzie Borden axe murdered her mother and father with 40 whacks each in their home in Fall River, Massachusetts. These items are from that infamous house. This vault door used to be in the Lexington Hotel in Chicago, which served as a base of operations for Al Capone between 1928 and 1931. This used to be an entrance to one of the dozens of secret passageways in the hotel that led to hidden tunnels connecting Chicago taverns and whorehouses. This 1929 Ford Model AA truck was part of Al Capone's rum smuggling fleet. Liquor would be transported on trucks like these. This 1929 Lincoln Model L was used by gangster bootlegger Jack Legs Diamond, known as the Capone of the East Coast. Here's another car that was clearly used by gangsters. It's a 1932 Cadillac that was bulletproof, and it literally has portholes in the windows to shoot machine guns out of. It's also been shot at. This was Pretty Boy Floyd's pistol. He was formerly Public Enemy #1, just like Dillinger. Speaking of Dillinger, this was his personally owned shirt and handkerchief. And this was John Dillinger's bulletproof vest and revolver. He left these behind at the Little Bohemia Lodge when it was raided by the FBI, though he did somehow manage to evade them. There's an original Patty Hearst wanted poster, and a handwritten note by serial killer David Berkowitz. This letter is signed by Edith Delaney, a member of the Jim Jones People's Temple, who died during the mass suicide of the cult, when 909 of them died. There's the autographs of Otis Toole and Charles Manson. This is some original John Wayne Gacy artwork. The mass murderer was an artist, and he made this bizarre thing in 1981. There's a document regarding the Birdman of Alcatraz wanting to be released from Alcatraz. He was denied. And there's an autograph of Jeffrey Dahmer. There's the autograph of James Earl Ray, the assassin of Martin Luther King Jr. That shotgun was used by the Alabama Department of Corrections. There's an old Indiana State Penitentiary riot gun, and a ball and chain from San Quentin Prison in California. And here's some more prison relics, including some from Alcatraz and Joliet. Well, this exhibit is a bit lighter. It has some unique creations. This appears to be a combination of a car, boat, and airplane. This is a wooden car, made completely out of wood. That's highly flammable. That's the bumper car. The body is completely composed of chrome bumpers. Here are some creations made from tractor parts. This one is called Impressed. It received the Guinness World Record back in 1972 for being the world's lowest car, with a total height of 26.5 inches. Here's a gallery of some miscellaneous antique vehicles. This is an 1859 hand-drawn manual tub pumper, produced by Hunneman, the first company to manufacture fire apparatuses in the country. This is a Model T without its body, just its engine, chassis, and wheels. This 1925 Studebaker served as a police car in Galena, Illinois. That's a wonderful town where Ulysses S. Grant lived. Oh my gosh, this was Hugh Hefner's car. It's a 1967 Lincoln Continental that was used by Hugh Hefner and his barrage of much younger sexy ladies at the Playboy Mansion. This is one of my favorite things here, the Bicentennial Money Car. This 1976 Cadillac limousine is completely covered with 120,000 coins, mostly 1976 pennies adorning much of the entire body. When Muhammad Ali saw this, he said that it was the only car he'd ever seen that was prettier than him. All of these coins added a ton to the weight of the car. There are Kennedy half dollars and Indian head nickels on top of the car. There are special rare coins placed on the back, including a few ancient Roman coins. This is a 1906 Waltham Orient buckboard, a very old car. Here's another ancient one, a truck from 1909. And this is a 1908 Buick stake-bed truck. These were primarily used by telephone companies. Finally, here's a very rare 1937 Dodge with a long wheelbase. Here are some wax figures of famous authors and artists, including Mark Twain, Rembrandt, the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, Ernest Hemingway, Vincent van Gogh, and Pablo Picasso. This is a really awesome group. These were Thomas Edison's reading glasses. First Lady Florence Harding wore this black cape on Election Day in 1920, when her husband Warren G. Harding won the presidency, and when she became the first First Lady to ever vote. There's the black mourning purse and mourning veil of Florence Harding. She wore that during the funeral of President Harding in 1923. There is a conspiracy that Florence poisoned the president. Those were Florence Harding's formal doveskin gloves that she wore at the White House. There's an admission pass to President Harding's funeral service, and that was an admission card for the interment of the first unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery. This is the Lincoln exhibit. It's about the same as it used to be, but it is among the best collections of Abraham Lincoln artifacts out there. This is a replica of the carriage that Abraham Lincoln took to Ford's Theater on the fateful night of April 14th, 1865. The real one is at the Studebaker National Museum in South Bend, Indiana. There are locks of Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln's hair. This Lincoln portrait is composed of different antique objects, including an 1860s patriotic envelope featuring the Constitution, some tintypes, and some Civil War era newspapers. Here's a seated wax figure of Abraham Lincoln. Many of the wax figures here were from an old museum, but I'm not sure from where. This chair was in Abraham Lincoln's study at the White House, so he presumably sat in this chair frequently during some very difficult times. And this chair was also used by Abraham Lincoln in his fancy presidential rail car. Notice the fabric is worn at the end of the seat. That was apparently caused by Lincoln getting up and down. The shoes and the dress were owned and worn by First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln. This is a funeral dress that was worn by Eliza Blair at Lincoln's funeral. She was the wife of Francis Blair, a longtime Democrat who stayed loyal to the Union and served as an advisor to Lincoln throughout the war. This is an incredible relic. The 35-star flag that was carried by President Lincoln's bodyguard and flag bearer, Master Sergeant Stimmel. This flag was very likely present at the Gettysburg Address and many other important events. There's a land grant that was signed by Lincoln, and some vintage postcards of the Lincoln home. There's a little section of burial cloth that was used in Lincoln's final funeral service at Oak Ridge Cemetery. This was Mary Todd Lincoln's mourning veil. She wore this during the president's funeral ceremonies in DC, but she couldn't bear to attend the rest. She wore mourning attire like this throughout the rest of her life, and that was her mourning fan, also all black, and there's a rare CDV of the First Lady by Matthew Brady. That was Abraham Lincoln's razor. He stopped using it after getting a letter from a little girl who said he'd be more electable if he grew a beard. There's also his spoon, and a piece of roof from the house that Lincoln's father, Thomas, married his stepmother, Sally Bush Johnston. That house in Elizabethtown, Kentucky no longer stands. There's some Civil War battlefield relics. A lock of John Brown's hair. And some Lincoln dollars. This reed pump organ belonged to the Lincolns. Mary would play it in the White House. There's some old photographs of the log cabins that Lincoln grew up in. I don't believe any of those survived. And there's a colonial style dollhouse. This is a replica of Lincoln's death chair, the one he was sitting in at Ford's Theater when he was shot. And that's an authentic piece of the upholstery from that chair. It is now at the Henry Ford Museum. The window frame is from the home of William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, and there's a piece of the original Rutledge New Salem mill dam, which was at the small town where Lincoln lived during his 20s. Here are prints and photographs of the 3 weeks of Lincoln funeral events. There's an authentic piece of the Lincoln funeral catafalque, and a ribbon from it. The catafalque is still used today for those who lie in state in the rotunda of the US Capitol, and this piece was obtained by Captain Alexander Austin, who was part of Lincoln's honor guard. That's a hubcap from the gun caisson that carried the Lincoln assassination conspirators' bodies after they were hanged, and those were the manacles worn by Lewis Payne, or Lewis Powell, who was in on the conspiracy and stabbed Secretary of State William Seward to near death that night. This is the doorknob from Mary Surratt's boarding house, where the conspirators gathered to plan the Lincoln assassination, and there's a lock of Mary Surratt's hair. She was the first woman hanged in US history. These are fragments of bandages that were around Mary Surratt's hands when hanged, along with some bits of the hanging ropes. This plaque used to be at the site where Abraham Lincoln and John Todd Stewart had their law office in Springfield. I don't believe that location is marked anymore. This was Mary Todd Lincoln's mourning skirt. She first wore this when their son Willie died at the White House in 1862, and then again after her husband was slain. That coin was placed on Abraham Lincoln's eyelid just after he passed away in the Peterson boarding house. Placing coins on the eyes of the deceased was a common practice back then, and this is the handkerchief that was wrapped around Lincoln's jaw just after he expired to keep his jaw closed until rigor mortis set in. It is clearly stained with the president's blood. These handles were on Lincoln's original outer coffin. They were removed in 1874 when they exhumed Lincoln to put him in the new tomb and to check on him. This drapery cord was placed on a window curtain at the Springfield home after he died. This is the only surviving section of the carpet on which Lincoln stood during his second inauguration in March of 1865. He gave one of his greatest speeches while standing on this carpet. And this coat was worn to Abraham Lincoln's second inauguration. Not sure by who, but it was there. The Lincoln collection here is astounding. This is a sculpture of Ganesha, an elephant-headed Hindu god who is known as the remover of obstacles. Here's a new display I was interested in seeing: the Hall of Christ. It's set up like a little chapel with the Last Supper in wax. This wax tableau may have been at an older wax museum. There are a few others out there, but this three-dimensional reproduction of Leonardo da Vinci's famous painting is really cool. There's Judas. There are also these 20 pieces of original stone which the Crusaders used to build the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre over Jesus' tomb in Jerusalem. This alcove is a 9/11 memorial. It looks like it is centered around the original blueprints of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in Manhattan. They broke ground on the Twin Towers in 1966 and were completed in 1973. They were two of the tallest buildings in the country, and decades later came crashing down in the most horrific terrorist attack in US history on September 11th, 2001. The walls have pictures from 9/11, a tribute to Flight 93, and a wall with the names of all those killed. There are some cars in the hallway connecting these exhibits, including some gems like Colonel Sanders' car. This classic 1939 Lincoln K limousine was chauffeur driven for Colonel Harlan Sanders during special events. This is the only known surviving example of the Packard 7 Pass. It was built in 1917 and has some features not found in most Packard cars. This was Howard Hughes' personal limousine. The eccentric billionaire once rode around in this. This was also the car that started this collection. And next to it is a hand-carved eagle made out of a single piece of wood. Here's an exhibit on Harry Houdini, the great magician. This was Harry Houdini's burlap straitjacket. He would use this in his famous straitjacket escape act. He claimed that he had to dislocate his shoulders in order to get the arms through, which wasn't true. This was one of Houdini's traveling show trunks. And here are some leg and handcuffs used by Houdini during his performances, along with his key-making die. That's a slice of petrified wood. It's 160 million years old. You can see some way bigger chunks in Holbrook, Arizona. And this is the ocular device that was worn by Nicolas Cage in National Treasure. These were created by Benjamin Franklin, and Nicolas Cage used these to read the map on the back of the Declaration of Independence. This is pretty awesome. A chariot that was screen used in the 1959 Ben-Hur, starring Charlton Heston. I'm not sure if this was used during the glorious chariot race scene. Here's an exhibit on Egyptian artifacts. No, they unfortunately don't have any real ones. These are just Egyptian movie props, which are still really neat. This costume was worn by Elizabeth Taylor as Cleopatra in the classic 1963 Cleopatra film. This Egyptian-themed chair was also in that film. These bracelets were screen used in the Cecil DeMille epic, The Ten Commandments. Here's a gilt-painted statuette of a bird-headed man. This was screen used in Cleopatra. Here are some more screen-used costumes and props from those movies. These are a charioteer's garments from the Ten Commandments. And this stool was also used in Cleopatra. And this case contains a lot of jewelry, necklaces, and a loincloth from the Ten Commandments in 1956, and it's topped by a Roman gladius sword from Cleopatra. There is a small exhibit on country music stars. There used to be a lot more country memorabilia, so I think this area is a work in progress. Inside this giant guitar there is a wax figure of Johnny Cash and a gown of June Carter. This fantastic 1957 Lincoln Continental Mark II was owned and driven by Conway Twitty. It's one of the fanciest Mark IIs ever built. This suit jacket was stage worn by Conway Twitty, and this was Conway Twitty's guitar. Here's a full case of country legend Hank Williams memorabilia. That's one of Hank Williams' shirts. There's a picture of him performing while wearing this one. Hank Williams wore this hat during his final performances with the Louisiana Hayride. There's another one of Hank Williams' hats and his glasses. And here's another one of his shirts. There's a lip impression of Billie Jean Williams Horton, the wife of Hank Williams, and after he died she married Johnny Horton, who sang the Battle of New Orleans. And here's a display on Patsy Cline, another one of the greatest country musicians. This was Patsy Cline's dress. Those were her boots and her wigs. She had to wear wigs after a horrible car crash she was involved in that left scarring. There's one of Cline's hats that she used throughout her career. That's her blouse, shoes, purse, and some more items down there. This is another new exhibit called A Journey Through Time. It features a bunch of antique clocks. There are hundreds of beautiful timepieces spanning several centuries within these cases. There's also 2 antique pianos and an organ. This exhibit does seem to be a work in progress as well. Here are some presidential clocks of the White House. This Victorian walnut clock was owned by President Grover Cleveland. On the left is a Zachary Taylor campaign clock, and next to it a clock from fellow General President Eisenhower's library. And next to that is a clock used in the White House during the Coolidge years. The Sessions mantle clock on the left was used during the Hoover administration. Next to it is a clock from Harry Truman's White House study, and on the right a mantle clock used during Taft's presidency. There's also a clock that was used in the White House library during the FDR years, and next to it is a signed Seth Thomas wall clock gifted to Andrew Jackson at the White House. This one is really interesting. It's the Market Garden Clock. It was presented to General Eisenhower by the exiled Dutch government to honor Operation Market Garden, which failed as it was a bridge too far. Eisenhower kept this clock in the White House, but insisted that it not be wound or used at all because it reminded him of the failure. This grandfather clock was presented to President Truman in 1950 by the Senate. It was used in the East Room and the East Hall of the White House. This is one of the new celebrity artifacts at historic auto attractions, Miss Belvedere. This was a new 1957 Plymouth Belvedere that in 1957 was buried and sealed in an underground vault in Tulsa, Oklahoma as a time capsule. Various objects from the 50s were placed inside this classic 50s car. Its set opening date was in 2007, exactly 50 years later. So in 2007, Miss Belvedere was finally unearthed. Unfortunately, the vault it was placed in was breached by water, so the car was clearly kind of messed up by water damage. The interior of the car is definitely dirty. But the unveiling of this car was a big deal in Tulsa, and now she's here at historic auto attractions. Very cool. Looks like a war room exhibit is under construction. I'd really like to see this. I think I know of a few things they have that are going to be inside. This is the one and only prototype of the 1967 Moz Ostentation Opera Sedan, built by the Moz Seaplane Company in Madison, Wisconsin. This car was designed to be the ultimate mode of personal transportation with the greatest of safety specifications. And many celebrities rode in this bizarre prototype, including Johnny Carson, Glenn Campbell, Joan Crawford, Jimmy Dean, Lawrence Welk, and more. And this is a safari car built in 1973 by the Moz Seaplane Company. This car was designed to go on wild safaris in Africa, and the seats could be lowered to turn into a sleeper. Next to it is the pelt of a Bengal tiger. That's Santa's sleigh. That just seems like a vintage one, but because it's this museum, it wouldn't surprise me at all if this belonged to Santa Claus. This is a 1928 Franklin Airman passenger limousine. Here's a classic 1912 Model T Roadster with a mother-in-law seat in the back. This 1929 Ford Model A was used as a taxi cab in Crested Butte, Colorado. And here's a 1924 Fordson tractor. These were the first tractors produced on assembly line by Ford. It cost $400 in the 20s, so it was fairly affordable. Way in the back of the new expansion, even though there is some space still walled off for more displays, is the racing exhibit. This GT was driven by Davy Jones. Terry Kaiser won the 1987 and 1988 IDBA Funny Bike National Championship with this bike and set some records with it. These are the driving suits of Don Prudhomme and John Force. This was Mario Andretti's 1991 Indy car. He drove this in the Indy 500 that year and came in 7th. Here's a vintage 1929 Indy car. This was raced in the 1929 Indy 500. Here's Joe Amato's Hemi-powered top fuel dragster from 1991. Joe Amato won the NHRA Fuel Top Championship 5 times. And behind it is another elongated dragster, a 1960 Slingshot which was rather dangerous. This is a 1984 sprint car. It was driven by Harold Wertjes, who accumulated over 100 wins in this car. Here's a 1955 Buick Nailhead dragster. This is a cool relic, a mechanic's jacket from the early Indy 500 races. The first one was in 1911, and back then a mechanic had to ride on the race cars. There's a helmet and goggles from one of those early Indy races. That's a racing piston signed by Dale Earnhardt. And that's a chunk of blacktop from the original Daytona Speedway, the old beach and road race course that was used before the present Speedway opened in 1959. There's some really big stuff over here. This is a Sikorsky S-61 helicopter transmission. Marine One, the presidential helicopter, uses this same transmission. This is a hydroplane, a super fast boat that skims over water. This boat used to be out in front of the museum. Not sure what its significance is. This is Bigfoot, known as the king of the monster trucks. It was built by Bob Chandler in 1979 and is 15 feet tall. It has some colossal tires, wow. This is a Tora motorcycle that was built by Rockford Motors right near here in Rockford, Illinois. It is in its original crate. This is the Bonneville Boss, a 1975 LSR hauler. It's also called a tornado-powered lowboy transporter that would carry the Proud American, that rocket on the top, that was used for land speed racing at the Bonneville Salt Flats of Utah. And this was one of Craig Breedlove's Spirit of America land speeders that he used on the Bonneville Salt Flats. He broke a lot of speed records with these vehicles. This was the first Ford car that ever climbed Pikes Peak in Colorado on July 1st, 1916. It's a 1914 Model T, and it participated in the Pikes Peak Hill Climb on the brand new Pikes Peak Auto Highway. A 15-year-old in Texas convinced his parents to take the Model T and take a family trip to do the race. It took several days to prepare and several days to ascend Pikes Peak during that time. They were the first ones to reach the 14,000 foot high summit during that race. And here's a Florida swamp buggy racer. This was the first trophy presented to race car driver Cotton Owens at Daytona for Fast Qualifier in 1959. That's an antique midget racer. This was Dick Trickle's 1970 Purple Mustang. He made 67 record-setting short track victories with this car. That was a 1977 Monte Carlo winner, here in this other section full of race cars. And this was another one of Dick Trickle's cars. In the very back is the Illinois Stock Car Hall of Fame. The owner of this museum builds race car chassis and has long been involved with stock car racing, so here's the local Hall of Fame for the motorsport, featuring lots of memorabilia of the inductees. Now we're going to see what remains to me the best and most impressive collection here, the Kennedy exhibit. While it's largely the same as it was, an extra room has been added to the exhibit, so it's less cluttered and there are a few new artifacts. This open-top limousine was used to drive President Kennedy when he visited Fort Stewart, Georgia in November of 1962, not long after the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved. He sat right there. A lot of this exhibit is focused on the assassination, and here's the first of many impressive relics from that horrible time, the taxicab, which Lee Harvey Oswald used to take just after shooting the president. Supposedly. The driver reported that he tried to make conversation, asking his passenger what he thought happened, but Oswald was stone cold. Those two outfits belong to Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. And this is a full alcove featuring the clothing of Camelot, an impressive collection of Jackie Kennedy's outfits. She was very well versed in fashion, and during her time as First Lady, she hired the famed designer Oleg Cassini to design and create her custom outfits. So here are over 20 of her custom-made Cassini outfits. This evening gown was worn by the First Lady at a fancy White House event. That's also the necklace Jackie wore for the cover of this issue of Life magazine. This is an inaccurate replica of the 1961 Lincoln Continental limousine that JFK was riding in when he was assassinated. This replica is missing the middle seat where Texas Governor John Connally sat. There are two wax figures of John and Jackie Kennedy as they appeared just moments before it happened. The real one is at the Henry Ford Museum. Some serious alterations were made on it as it continued service. But directly behind this replica is the real Secret Service car that was following directly behind the presidential limo on that fateful day. This vehicle is absolutely incredible because it is in its original condition. This is just how it looked on November 22nd, 1963. Agent Clint Hill was stationed on this car during the Dallas motorcade, and after the shots rang out, he leaped onto the backside of the presidential limo to try and shield Jackie, as can be seen in the Zapruder film. Wow, that is incredible. Many of the pieces in this exhibit are from the Robert White collection, which was the largest private assemblage of Kennedy relics. Many were obtained directly from Evelyn Lincoln, JFK's personal secretary, and eventually the owner of this museum got a hold of a lot of that collection, and Mr. Lensing has also acquired some other fascinating relics. John F. Kennedy gifted this fine Lord Elgin watch to Jackie's secretary. These are samples of suit patterns that were sent to JFK by his tailor in June of 1963. Those JFK 464 bumper stickers were presented to JFK at the Oval Office. He put them in his desk drawer, from which they were removed after his assassination. Sadly, there was no JFK for 64, and he briefly wore this 1960 campaign hat during a stop in Baltimore. This dictaphone and the earpiece were used by President Kennedy and his secretary Evelyn Lincoln for documenting purposes in the Oval Office. JFK's fedora is atop a weird wax head of him. It was designed by the famous hat maker Harry Roenick. That is a section of wood from the inaugural platform, on which JFK gave his famous inaugural address. This Lord Elgin watch was worn by John F. Kennedy during the inauguration ball. Those were JFK's shoes and the jacket that he wore to the inauguration ball on the night of his inauguration. This flag flew over the Capitol building on one of the days of JFK's funeral. This is interesting, a section of the original grassy knoll fence, which stood on the grassy knoll on Dealey Plaza. There are conspiracies that a shooter was hiding behind this fence. The fence was removed and placed in the former Conspiracy Museum in Dallas, The fence was heavily graffitied, and there someone wrote that it was Johnson. These are two pieces of upholstery from the Assassination limo. All of the original upholstery was removed, and that piece is clearly stained with John F. Kennedy's blood. That's an original negative of the blood-soaked back seat taken by the FBI, and two original photos used by the Warren Commission. That's a letter signed by H.L. Hunt, an oil tycoon who had ties to Lyndon Johnson, and a common subject of JFK assassination conspiracies. These were the contents of President Kennedy's briefcase that he took with him to Texas. At least one of these was read en route. There's an original pamphlet for the art exhibition for President Kennedy and the First Lady. The room where JFK spent his last night in the Hotel Texas in Fort Worth was decorated with over 20 valuable art pieces, including a Picasso, I believe. JFK took that notepad from his room at the Hotel Texas and left it on board Air Force One that day. All of these papers were removed from Kennedy's Oval Office desk just after the assassination. This eyeglass case was removed from JFK's desk on Air Force One while en route from Dallas to Washington after the assassination. These eyeglasses were worn by Evelyn Lincoln while Lyndon Johnson was being sworn in aboard Air Force One. She is visible wearing these glasses in the iconic photograph of the historic moment. That's a section of wood from the platform on which John F. Kennedy gave his last official speech on November 21st at Brooks Air Force Base in San Antonio. That was the president's copy of the dedication speech at Brooks Air Force Base. It was removed from JFK's Air Force One desk. There's a report written by Kennedy's personal physician, who was there in Dallas and at the hospital when he died, and there are two prescriptions he filled at Palm Beach in 1963. That was Dr. Berkeley's medical bag. He did bring this one to Dallas, and below it is the purse that Evelyn Lincoln carried in the Dallas motorcade, along with most of the contents that were in it. She also put Jackie's blood-soaked gloves in that purse. And this is the original scissor jack from the X-100 limo that JFK was assassinated in. This is Lee Harvey Oswald's wedding dress. He wore this at his wedding, and he brought this suit with him when he defected to the Soviet Union in 1959. This here is the ambulance that transported a dying Lee Harvey Oswald to Parkland Memorial Hospital right after he was shot in the stomach during a transport deep within the Dallas Police Headquarters basement just 2 days after the assassination. This museum also used to have his original gravestone. That was Lee Harvey Oswald's sweater. Alongside this rifle, just like the one Oswald supposedly used, is the actual catalog for Clyde sporting goods that Lee Harvey Oswald used to order the gun he would assassinate President Kennedy with. Just a couple hours after the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald was located and arrested at the Texas Theater, where this chair is from. The arresting officer of Lee Harvey Oswald was Nick McDonald, and this was his police uniform, alongside the jacket of Jack Ruby, who would then kill Lee Harvey Oswald. There's Jack Ruby's hat and the shoes he was wearing when he shot Oswald. Jack Ruby was a nightclub owner and involved with the mafia, so this Dallas entertainment guide was in his pocket when he killed Oswald. Jack Ruby used this bag to make cash deposits just before he killed Oswald, and there are some photos from Ruby's time at the Dallas County Jail. The gun on the left was Jack Ruby's backup gun, which he hid in his boot, and that Colt revolver was owned by Dallas Police Captain Will Fritz, who was involved with the investigation. There's a Dallas PD badge from the time, the original license plate from the Oswald ambulance, and this was Jack Ruby's black necktie with a mezuzah symbol. On this wall they have Jack Ruby's polygraph test, and a bullet fired from the gun that killed Lee Harvey Oswald. Here's a wax depiction of that notorious killing. Jack Ruby just walked in the basement surrounded by police officers on live TV and fatally shot Lee Harvey Oswald. It was incredibly bizarre. And this is a window from the Texas School Book Depository. This one was actually the window next to the one Oswald fired out of. It was located just to the right of that corner window on the 6th floor. That's kind of what the view of Dealey Plaza and the motorcade looked like from this window, extremely similar to Oswald's angle. In this small replication of the East Room of the White House is a flag-draped casket. This recreates the scene when President John F. Kennedy lay in state in the East Room on November 23rd, when various government officials came to pay their respects the day after the assassination. But that flag is the actual honor guard flag that draped John F. Kennedy's casket while he lay in state in the East Room. This flag was switched out before the casket was moved to lie in state on the Capitol the next day, and for the flag folding in Arlington. So that was a different flag presented to Jackie Kennedy, and that one is now at the JFK Presidential Library, but they almost never display it. So this is fascinating to see, and is displayed in a very reverent setting. By the way, that is an authentic chandelier that used to be in the China Room of the White House during the 1930s. This is the flag that flew over the United States Capitol on November 21st, 1963, which was the day JFK left for Texas. This is some of the mourning cloth that adorned the East Room while President Kennedy lay in state. This is a John F. Kennedy funeral card that was signed by his mother, Rose Kennedy. Here's an invitation to the President's funeral service at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, D.C. I have been inside there. This is an original copy of the itinerary for Kennedy's funeral procession, which was rapidly developed with a lot of Jackie's input. She based it on Abraham Lincoln's funeral. These rosary beads were carried by Father James N. Thompson, one of the two priests who gave Kennedy his last rites in the emergency room at Parkland Memorial Hospital. He carried these beads everywhere he went from that day on. And this is a pamphlet that Father Thompson wrote at Robert Kennedy's request, outlining his experience that day. The other priest who administered the last rites to the dying president was Father Oscar Huber, who owned this funerary cross. On the left is a letter written by Dr. Berkeley on his memories of November 22nd, alongside a letter signed by Father Huber. And this is another very iconic artifact of the slain president's funeral: Jackie's funeral hat and veil. She wore this one during the service at St. Matthew's Cathedral, and probably during the walk from the White House to St. Matthew's, but this one was removed before the burial ceremony at Arlington. That's pretty amazing. Jackie Kennedy was featured on the cover of Life magazine 17 times, and here's a copy of all of them. So this is the new area of the JFK exhibit, focused more so on the Kennedy family and administration. There's also some new artifacts in here. This case contains a lot of clothing of the Kennedy family, including several of Jackie's jackets, and on the left is JFK Jr.'s child Navy suit. That was Jackie's maternity dress, JFK Jr.'s riding suit, and some clothes of Caroline Kennedy when she was a child, like her Easter egg suit. That flag bunting was on the inaugural platform, and there are some tickets to the inauguration. Here are some suits of JFK, alongside this very unique John F. Kennedy campaign dress. This was worn by a supporter in 1960. That's pretty cool. And yes, these suits were worn by John F. Kennedy, the one on the right while he was a senator, and the one in the center while he was president. There's a piece of JFK's hair in there. These objects were owned by Carl Peden, who was a co-pilot of Air Force One during the Kennedy years. He was co-piloting when they returned to Washington from Dallas. That box contains some original film footage of President Kennedy taken on the morning of November 22nd in Fort Worth using that camera. This ledger is from the Oleg Cassini workroom and has 17 pages devoted to Jackie Kennedy designs, with some fabric samples. This leather case with a nail filer and a sharp knife was thrown away by Jackie Kennedy when she was packing to move out of the White House. Someone dumpster dived to save it. And this keychain featuring a medal of Pope John XXIII was on JFK's keychain for a time.
This exhibit is just phenomenal. It's definitely as good, if not better, than the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. Those were John F. Kennedy's shoes. He wore those while he was a senator from Massachusetts. And I like this coffee with Kennedy cup from the 1960 campaign. This one was actually used by JFK during one of his campaign breakfast events. This is one of my favorite pieces in the entire museum. A preserved 60-year-old birthday cake topper from JFK's infamous birthday party at Madison Square Garden on May 19, 1962, where Marilyn Monroe sang "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" in a very sultry voice. This was part of the massive show birthday cake, and the owner of this museum has taken a very small bite out of it. Here are some original photographs from Madison Square Garden of JFK and Marilyn. There's definitely some controversy there, and Marilyn was dead a few months later. These are receipts from Marilyn Monroe's use of Execucar ink while in New York City for the president's birthday party. The top shelf contains some magazines featuring Robert F. Kennedy, John's younger brother who was also assassinated. That is a family Christmas card put out by Robert and Ethel Kennedy for 1967, which turned out to be their last Christmas together. This is a wax figure of Robert F. Kennedy, who also had an illustrious career and was running for president in 1968, during which he was assassinated, less than 5 years after his brother. This wax figure used to be with the World Leaders tableau. I think he fits better over here. There's a card for RFK's funeral at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. This case contains even more articles of Jackie Kennedy. Again, she was very fashion conscious. There's some of her shoes and her formal gloves. That's a wax head of Jackie adorning her French room designer hat. And here are some of her perfumes and combs. This is a scale reproduction of Air Force One, showing what it looked like on the inside, at least back then. This is unique, the printing plate for the November 23, 1963 edition of the Dallas Morning News, with the headline that President Kennedy was slain on a Dallas street and that Lyndon Johnson became president. That's a no parking funeral sign because of JFK's funeral, and this is a large printing plate of the iconic photograph of JFK Jr. saluting his father's casket. On the left is a Dallas City directory from 1963, which includes the information of many key figures from the assassination, and on the right is a Warren Commission report signed by all members of the commission, including future President Gerald Ford. These are Lee Harvey Oswald's exhumation files. His body was exhumed in 1981 to determine whether it was really his body or that of a Russian imposter. It was apparently him in there. These are Jack Ruby's second trial appeal papers, outlining Ruby's complaints that the court made several unjust moves against him. That envelope was in Evelyn Lincoln's purse and is stained with John F. Kennedy's blood. She even typed on there, it says, "My beloved president's blood." Blood rubbed off on the envelope when Jackie Kennedy took off her bloody white gloves and had Evelyn Lincoln hold them at the hospital. She put the gloves in her purse with the envelope. Here is a belt buckle and the gloves worn by Larry Bruce Smith, who was a Navy pallbearer during the funeral ceremonies of President Kennedy. Apparently the pallbearers hastily practiced by filling a casket with heavy sandbags to weigh 1,300 pounds. And they repeatedly marched on the Memorial Amphitheater steps at dark before the funeral. And we're moving on to even more presidential memorabilia in the White House exhibit. There are 4 tableaus containing furnishings that once graced particular rooms of the executive mansion. All of these were in the music room during various administrations. Several pieces are from the Kennedy years, but that music box was in the music room during the McKinley years. This is the green room, with a marble top table and a coffee table from the Truman era, and an Eisenhower era chair and couch. The sideboard back there is also Truman. Here is the blue room, but the marble table was used in the war room during FDR's time. The 3-piece set was in the blue room during the Eisenhower and Kennedy years, and that executive desk back there is from the Chester Arthur administration. The yellow chairs are also Kennedy. And this is the red room, with a Truman card table, Carter concert chairs that were used in the East Room. The red sofa and chair are from the Franklin Roosevelt years. This sofa was used by the Trumans for formal functions around the Rose Garden, and that chair is also from the Truman White House. The writing desk was gifted to the Eisenhower White House by the state of New York, and there's a Truman-era sideboard. That lamp was used at Camp David. These chairs were also used at that presidential retreat in Maryland. And there are plenty more presidential chairs. These furnishings were used by Theodore Roosevelt and his family at the White House. He was the first one to call the executive mansion the White House. This wooden dresser was used by First Ladies Mamie Eisenhower and Jackie Kennedy. The rocking chair was gifted to Cardinal Cushing by President Kennedy. The Cardinal was a longtime friend of the Kennedy family. The caneback chair was personally owned by President Eisenhower and used in the Oval Office. And next to it is a William Morris chair that was gifted to FDR. He kept it in his personal study. This is not a president's chair, but instead a chair of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He purchased this chair in 1966 to use in his Georgia cabin, where he wrote some of his final books and essays, like Where Do We Go From Here? And there's a wax figure of Martin Luther King Jr. This was the first mechanical sewing machine that was used in the White House. The newfangled technology arrived while James K. Polk was president in 1848, and this red couch was gifted by the state of California to President Eisenhower. It was appropriately placed in the Red Room. Here are some artifacts of the Johnsons, including one of Lyndon B. Johnson's suits. He was definitely a big guy. I would not want to be on the receiving end of the Johnson treatment. There are 3 of LBJ's hats, his watch, keychain, and an LBJ campaign hat. And this was Lady Bird Johnson's dress. This pink dress was also Lady Bird's, along with her gloves, shoes, glasses, hats, bracelets, and more. This is Rosalind Carter's dress and some Carter memorabilia. This was Richard Nixon's personal desk from the White House. Here are some Nixon artifacts, including some clothing of First Lady Pat Nixon. Here's one of her dresses alongside a suit worn by Richard Nixon. Pat Nixon wore that hat on an African safari. And there's a telephone and directory from the Nixon White House. That is a piece of wood from George Washington's original casket. These are some unusual painted life masks of George Washington and Rutherford B. Hayes. This is an authentic ticket to Andrew Johnson's impeachment trial. Now these were hot tickets back during the first presidential impeachment. Below the heads are some Nixon inauguration programs. Those are walking canes topped with the heads of Presidents Benjamin Harrison and William Howard Taft. There's Theodore Roosevelt's sterling silver spoon and Zachary Taylor's razor. I believe relics of Taylor are the rarest presidential artifacts to find. This was Grace Coolidge's rose chiffon stole, worn by the fashionable First Lady of the Roaring Twenties. Alongside some First Lady autographs are 2 Indian Peace Medals from the James Monroe and John Quincy Adams administrations. Here is some Ronald Reagan memorabilia, including one of his suit jackets, along with a flag that flew at half-staff over the US Capitol on June 9th, 2004, a few days after he passed away. There's a Reagan presidential M&M box and a piece of the Berlin Wall. That's a George W. Bush inauguration program and a flag that was signed by George H.W. Bush. Here's a collection of presidential pens. The presidents do get lots of custom pens. This pen was used by President John F. Kennedy to sign the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in October of 1963, which prohibited the testing of nukes underwater, in the atmosphere, or in space, so that was really good. And these were JFK's gold writing pens, which he apparently used to doodle with. This pen was used by Ronald Reagan to sign the Social Security Amendment of 1983, and this flag flew over the White House. It was taken down at noon on January 20th, 1977, the exact time Gerald Ford's presidency ended and Jimmy Carter's began. Now entering the NASA Exploratory, a small space exhibit within historic auto attractions. This place really has everything. This is a replica Apollo command capsule, just like the ones that teams of 3 astronauts would stay in during the Apollo moon missions. These were clearly some very tight quarters. This is a recreation of the Freedom 7 capsule, which was piloted by Alan Shepard in the first US human spaceflight in 1961. This is a main landing gear tire of Space Shuttle Discovery. I have seen that space shuttle before. This was Gene Cernan's spacesuit glove from the Apollo 17 mission, worn on the moon. Cernan was the last man to walk on the moon thus far. Here's a miniature model of the Saturn V rocket sections. This was the flag that draped over astronaut Ted Freeman's casket during his burial at Arlington. He was expected to be an Apollo astronaut, but died in a plane accident in 1964, so he was technically the first fatality of the astronaut corps. This is a replication of Ham the chimpanzee's biopack couch. Ham was the first chimp to enter space in 1961 during a test to see if astronauts could really survive in space. The real one is at the New Mexico Museum of Space History, where Ham is also buried, and I have been there. There's a mini lunar lander and a mock-up lunar sample return container, which they would use to collect moon rock samples. And here are 7 simulated moon rocks, copies of those collected by Apollo astronauts. Now on to some movie and TV cars. The TV part of this exhibit has actually been downsized. This is a Back to the Future DeLorean time machine. Now there are a lot of these out there at different car museums. I think DeLoreans in their original condition are more rare now, since most have been turned into time machines. This one was not screen used in Back to the Future, but it's fun to see, and there are wax figures of Doc Brown and Marty McFly. This is the Flintstone-mobile from the 1994 live-action film, plus a police uniform from the sequel, Viva Rock Vegas. There are 3 Batmobiles here. The first one is a classic Batmobile from the 1960s Batman TV series. This was created by the legendary Hollywood car designer George Barris. He used the Ford Motor Company's abandoned Futura concept to make one of the most iconic cars in pop culture. This is the screen-used Batmobile from Batman Returns. Reportedly, every gadget on this car was fully functional, like the jet engine. And this is the Bat Missile from Batman Returns, a thin version of the Batmobile. There's also creepy wax figures of the Joker and the Penguin. This is Ecto-1, or at least a replica of the Ectomobile from Ghostbusters. This is another controversial one. I don't believe this is a real screen-used car, as like the Back to the Future car, there's a lot of these out there. This 1964 Ford Galaxy Squad car was driven by Andy Griffith in The Andy Griffith Show. And this was Barney Fife's shirt, worn by Don Knotts in The Andy Griffith Show. Here is one of my favorites, the hideous Wagon Queen family truckster from National Lampoon's Family Vacation. I do love this movie. There is no dog leash attached to the back of the truckster. That's a missed opportunity. This is a full preserve set from the classic TV series Sanford and Son, featuring 2 screen-used costumes. And this is one of the 3 screen-used pickup trucks from Sanford & Son. Again, there used to be more to the TV section here in the original building, including lots of wax figures, which I believe they have since sold off. There is also an impressive Gone with the Wind display, featuring some fantastic costumes and props from the essential 1939 film. There's a screen-used mirror, along with some prop pillars, and a portrait of Rhett Butler that was at the movie's opening. This case contains some awesome relics, including Vivian Lee's costume petticoat, a Confederate cavalry jacket, Clark Gable's costume shirt, along with a vest and a tuxedo coat he wore in the movie. This was one of Carole Lombard's dresses. There's some artifacts from the opening premiere, prop servingware from the film, Vivian Lee's brooch and earrings, and her handkerchief. The final exhibit is the Animal Kingdom. There was a smaller taxidermy display here before, but now there's an entire chamber of dead animals right at the exit. Here's a polar bear, along with an Arctic wolf. This is the Alaskan brown bear. There's a wolverine, and a couple of smaller brown bears. And behind them is a harbor spotted seal. Those are pretty rare to see taxidermied. That's a king cobra strangling some rodents. They're of course very venomous. That's a rhinoceros mount. Here's a female lion, or lioness. And there's a sloth. Oh wow, that is a python. This one is 18 feet long. That's a baboon, standing next to this mighty ostrich. That is a taxidermied African bull elephant. It's absolutely amazing. This one is among the largest known bull elephants to have ever lived. It's over 10 feet high and 21 feet long, and it lived on a delta in Botswana. There's an alligator, and the head of a hippopotamus. And there are some critters in a canoe. This is a male African lion, a king of the animal kingdom, and of course they have no problem eating humans as well. On the opposite side, there are some American forest animals, like the deer, skunk, and pheasants. There's a stuffed possum, and a peacock, a gorgeous avian. Next to the turkey is a mighty Canadian moose. And that's a black bear. I do really like this taxidermy tableau. Looks like that vicious mountain lion has captured some prey. Here's a Persian ibex. There's a group of these that live in New Mexico. And there's a zebra. And finally, there's a towering taxidermy giraffe. So that concludes this tour of the newly expanded and renovated historic auto attractions. I didn't think this place could get any better, but they have certainly managed to do just that. Seriously, this is one of my favorite museums I've ever been to. The quality of the artifacts here is astounding, and many of the areas the museum focuses on are those that I am very interested in, so to me, this is basically the perfect museum. I cannot recommend visiting this place enough. If you like history or cars, then you are guaranteed to have a blast at Historic Auto Attractions. The museum is located just north of Rockford, Illinois, right before the Wisconsin state line, and it's right off Interstate 90 between Rockford and Madison, Wisconsin. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video and series, then please make sure to like this video, share it, and subscribe to my channel. Take a look at my arsenal of other videos featuring great museums like this, historic sites, roadside attractions, national parks, and more. Links to the other 5 parts of this Historic Auto Attraction series are linked in the video description. Thanks for watching.